Is there anything that happened where you all in good conscience, you said, and you made a decision saying, on balance, I think this is the right thing to do, and then turned out that you'd made not a horrific, but you'd made a decision that you didn't feel comfortable about?
We did have 4 of our people kidnapped in Angola.
Wow.
So we obviously made, not a mistake, but we put people in harm's way there, and they were kidnapped. I have always had a philosophy that secrets are not secrets in certain places. Every secret is a secret, but in some places it's not a secret.
Yeah.
A man's secret from his affairs may be secret to his family, but not to the men in the golf club, sort of thing.
Yeah, got it.
So you need to identify where the secret is not a secret.
Hello and welcome to the Intelligence Advantage podcast, where we talk to the movers and shapers in the investigation and intelligence space. My name is Gary Miller. I've been an investigative lawyer for nearly half a century, and I'm also the chairman of the IFG, a network of international investigative and asset recovery lawyers. I welcome a very dear and long-standing friend of mine, Patrick Grayson, to share stories and experiences with me. It's difficult to sum up in just a couple of lines Patrick's experience in this space. He has either guided, met, worked with all of the leading CEOs and owners of corporate investigation agencies over the years, and he is the point of call for anyone in the industry that needs wisdom and guidance. I'm thrilled to have you with me this afternoon. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you, Gary. I'm delighted to be here, and I hope I can live up to some of your kind, generous introduction.
No problem at all. That's the easy part. Now, I know, because I have known you for a while, I know that you started off in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, if I may refer to them, the Irish Guards, in fact.
That's
and
correct.
Having done a little bit of research, what appears to me is that it may well be, and the Irish Guards, who you're with, is a famous group all of its own, but you've been in interesting places at very interesting times. And I want you to tell me a little bit about how you turned up or ended up in a place and it just happened to be a hotspot, or a few examples of what's happened to you in the army and in your postings.
Oh, thank you, Gary. Well, yes, I joined as a regular officer, and I was actually joined in 1960, and I was the first intake into Sandhurst that was post-national service. So all those ahead of us had all been co-opted, or most had been co-opted, a large proportion, and we were the first 100% volunteer intake to Sandhurst, intake 29. So that was an interesting time. Sandhurst was then a 2-year course and a tremendously good training. And one thing which one should know about the British Army is that the people who teach you your skills and your trade are not the other officers; they're the non-commissioned officers. And anybody who's been to Sandhurst will be in awe of the tremendously wonderful non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, who taught us our skills and scared the shit out of us most of the time. But that was.
And everything we see on the screen about staff sergeants and don't call me sir, call me sergeant, and giving everyone a super hard time, it's the same in the British Army as it is in the American Army?
I have been with the American Army, but I'm not quite sure. But the famous phrase at Sandhurst, when the sergeant major talks to you, he says, "I call you sir and you call me sir. The difference, sir, is that you mean it, sir." And that's the sort of relationship. But it's a wonderful, extraordinary relationship that until you've experienced it, you can't imagine it. The bond between officers and non-commissioned officers and the soldiers. It's an extraordinary bond, and it never leaves you, really. It stays with you all your life.
You were talking about interesting places. You were in the Suez at a particular... No, in Aden, maybe.
In Aden, yes.
In Aden, sorry.
Yes, I caught, as I always say to people, I caught the tail end of the empire. Everywhere I went, they pulled down the flag.
Yes, well, I want to hear a bit about flag pulling in a minute.
Well, I was in Germany first. We're in the British Army of the Rhine, as it was called. When it was in the Cold War, 1962, when we really felt we were facing a threat from from East Germany. And we were on the Weser River to sort of hold the line should they come across the line. And it was serious soldiering then, quite nerve-wracking actually.
Shots fired across the Rhine?
No. It was tense, but the Cold War stuff. And Berlin, of course, was Berlin isolated, and we used to do train trips into Berlin, taking resupplies into Berlin through East Germany. That was very interesting. But that was peacetime soldiering. I was lucky enough from Germany to be appointed to Kenya, sent to Kenya in 1963, and that led up to Kenya independence in late '63, and that was an interesting time for Kenya, or Kenya we called it, Kenya, and there we
was that a violent birth?
It wasn't no, it wasn't actually. There had been a mutiny by the King's African Rifles, the Kenyan army, at the time we arrived there, and the Irish Guards, a company of Irish Guards, joined the Scots Guards there, and when we arrived in Kenya, they were spread around the country, helping to bring in line the mutineers. So that was tense, and I wasn't actually involved in that. But then we were there throughout the Uhuru, as they call it, independence,
right.
And we were scattered around the country during the actual ceremonies to keep a low profile, quite rightly. But it went very smoothly. And Kenyatta, the one-time terrorist, was by then the new president, which was an extraordinary event in many ways. And I was there when President Kennedy died, and like all of us, we always remember exactly where we were when he died. And I was walking up the stairs in the officers' mess when we heard the radio playing, and I thought it was a play, like a lot of people did, and that was Kennedy's death. And that was a big moment everywhere in the world, particularly in Kenya. And I found myself a few weeks later standing in the Catholic Cathedral in Nairobi as an officer with my sword around a coffin representing Kennedy, and my right wrist was on Kenyatta's shoulder, which was quite my brush with.
Wow. Do you still have that photo in your archive somewhere?
I do indeed. From the front page of the East African Standard, I
Wonderful.
think. Yes.
I tell you, I now kick myself for not being better prepared, Patrick, to say I want a photo of you in full regalia, but there you go.
No. So then I mean, if you want to go briefly my career, then I was back in England for Britain, back in Germany again. And then my next serious posting overseas was to Aden, what you referred.
Yes.
And that was 1966, 1967, when again, Aden was still a British colony. And we the British were being, they were local pressure groups were trying to get us out of Aden,
yes,
as was the colonial style. And there was a terrorist group, insurgency group, that was terrorizing Aden and terrorizing the British there. So it was really quite unpleasant, put it mildly.
So there were shots fired in that part of the world?
Yes. We the Irish Guards left behind 23 dead there.
Wow.
Buried in Aden. One of them, 4 of them were in a own goal. We had a horrible gun accident there which killed 4, which was tragically part of the active service.
Wow.
And we lost some in ambushes, etc. So that was a nasty time, unpleasant time. And growing up.
What lessons? Sorry, let me ask you this, because it's always these things sort of just appear momentarily. You're training, you've got your whatever it is, staff sergeant, non-commissioned officer, and then there you are with people sadly dying, etc. What's it like for somebody, you were still relatively young? Is it like a massive earthquake to your system, or are you so well prepared that it's business as usual?
Well, people in more recent times, having had a far more difficult time than I had, could probably speak to that, and I listen to them a lot. But when you're in a situation like that, it is, of course, exciting. There's no question. That's what you're trained for. Your adrenaline is up. And because you're surrounded by comrades and people close to you, you feel a tremendous esprit de corps. That's what soldiering in any army is all about. And that buoys you on. And as they always say, your training kicks in. that was hardwired in us. I surprised myself that when things were difficult, training kicked in.
Right.
And the relationship you had with your soldiers around you, your fellow, the whole team, it was extraordinary. And that really tests you. And those who've had far more difficult times in more recent times in Afghanistan and etc. have really found it very hard going. And I understand that. And the talk about we were less sympathetic then to stress, post-stress syndrome.
Yeah.
It was still a little bit of stiff upper lip. Not necessarily saying it was good or bad, but it was just different.
Just what it was. And
yeah.
Where after Aden?
Well, then I spent spells in UK, and then I found myself going to Hong Kong.
That's right, and that's that was a really interesting time for Hong Kong and China, wasn't it?
Well, it was. It was during the Cultural Revolution. I went there in 1986 when the Cultural Revolution was at its peak in China, and Hong Kong had always been isolated, but it was very isolated then.
Where were you based? Because, of course, I was in Hong Kong for a number of years.
Well, you were in Hong Kong. Well, we were based, well, I spent 2 stints in Hong Kong. I was there for 2 years as the ADC, the aide-de-camp to the general, the commander of British forces, who had been himself an Irish Guardsman. So I was sort of close to the source of
Is this Sai-Kung? Where were you?
Well, then I was in Flagstaff House in Hong Kong.
In Central, yes.
Hong Kong Island, yeah, with a whole household of staff working for the general then, the commander of British forces, who was the number 2 to the governor, a very senior position. So that was for me.
Who was the governor at that stage? Do you recall?
The governor was called Trench, but my boss was someone called General Sir Basil Euxter, who had been an Irish Guardsman himself, and he had distinction of having been a very young officer in the Irish Guards when they were on the Norwegian expedition at the beginning of the outbreak of the war, when the Irish Guards were on a ship sailing to Norway, and the ship was bombed by the Germans, and most of the officers were killed in one explosion.
Wow.
Young Euxter, as he was a second lieutenant or lieutenant, I think, and he found himself stark naked in the sea, having been blown overboard.
Not pleasant. Let me ask you what stood out to you in that first stint. You were in Flagstaff House, and the next stint was how many weeks, months, years later?
Well, 2 years later. I was there for 2 years doing that job, and that was tense because the army were then, British Army were eyeball to eyeball with the Chinese army, PLA, at the border right across the border.
So where were you stationed then? Still at Flagstaff or not?
No, Flagstaff was always then, but that was that then. And then my own battalion, the Irish Guards, were posted to Hong Kong by a happy coincidence. So I was already there. So after a brief stint, I stayed there, and then we were based in Stanley Fort. In
Stanley, gosh, you got some really peachy postings.
I did.
And Stanley was wonderful.
Oh, wonderful! Well, now it's a PLA barracks, I believe. But then we had my wife and I had a house that you would die for on the peninsula of Stanley Fort.
Fantastic!
But we spent most of our time up on the border, and that was it had its moments, to put it mildly.
Anything particular comes to mind of some weird scenario of someone scrambling over?
Oh yes. I had I always say it almost started the Third World War, almost personally. There's a village on the eastern side of the border where the border hits the sea called Chateau Coq. You may be familiar with it.
I do.
And
I know it well.
This village, famously, the border between British Hong Kong and China went down the main street, little village street. And there were bollards down the street demarcating the border. And it was very much an enclave, and there was always a British company there, a company of soldiers. Often it was Gurkha company, and then my company. And it was a real hot spot. And as you came along the border, the road came into Chateau Coq, and then you had to turn right to stay in British territory. So it was so dramatic you couldn't get it wrong. And to help, there was usually a PLA soldier standing by the wine shop, it was called, with his gun, looking at you as you drove down. So you turned right and sort of waved at him and went along the border. But it didn't come for the Irish Guards, who turned left. We had a truck that went down there, I was
You
just
weren't in
thinking
charge of that truck, were you,
no,
Patrick?
well, it was my truck, but I wasn't driving it.
Okay,
It
thank
was
God.
a terrible mistake, no doubt about it. It was a Land Rover and a truck behind with in total eight guards on board. And unfortunately, the PLL soldier had gone for a break, and he wasn't there. And the driver got it wrong and turned left. And I'm making light of it, but actually it was a very serious incident. They disappeared down Chung Ying Street, and I was in one of the observation posts, and I heard a shot ring out, bing, 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 across the rooftops, and I thought disaster had happened. What did happen was that they were immediately surrounded by a group of very angry Shattercock residents from the Chinese side with knives, etc., and they disappeared into Shattercock and were taken prisoner. So
and the shots were fired by?
Well, it was a misfire by the Chinese, but it set the alarms going.
I see.
And there was a mini riot right on the border, with people on the toes of the border. And I was there with a Chinese policeman trying to calm it down, which we did. And then actually it went right high up the political chain of command. It had been an incursion, and it was our fault. And it reached Peking as an issue, and James Callan was Prime Minister. Yeah, it was really dramatic, and it was a grave mistake on our part, an accident. But for 24 hours, I was alone in Shattercock with my soldiers, not knowing whether it was going to come out right. And then negotiations happened right up the line. And then 3 o'clock in the morning, we heard the trucks revving up right behind Shattercock in the night. Right. And then these 8 rather shamefaced guardsmen came back.
Traipsing back. But not with some takeaway. Actually, this is really cheeky, isn't it? Not with some takeaway food, I guess.
No, they've been well treated, but it was very alarming and a mistake on our part.
And give me a time anchor in terms of Cultural Revolution. Are you there at the beginning?
My history probably is not fully. Well, I was there 68 to 72.
So you were right in the middle of it.
Right in the middle. Yeah. Now, Hong Kong was very tense.
And what vibes? To what extent would you? Of course, you're on the border a lot of the time, but what do you pick up out of the Cultural Revolution? Are there? I'd say obviously, are there people that are trying to escape and getting across to Hong Kong, or what do you as a soldier learn about history, about that period of time?
Well, it was the stark contrast. And I've been also on the border in Berlin, and I've been to Panmunjom on the Korean border.
Right.
And every case, as you peer across the border or cross the border, the change is discernible. You can feel it in your bones. And as you looked across the paddy fields to the north side of the border in Hong Kong, you're looking into an alien territory of people under a different regime and tilling the fields. And it was extraordinary sort of view into another world. And I know and in Panmunjom, when I was in Hong Kong, I was attached for a period of time to the US 8th Army in Korea, and was on the DMZ with them, which was interesting, and went to Panmunjom itself. And there was the ever-increasing bigger flags, and it was quite scary. And there's a 3-mile cordon sanitaire. In Hong Kong, there wasn't. It was just a fence. And we used to have Chinese soldiers patrolling with their weapons as close as you and I would be. It was really.
And did you have any instances of people that were being maltreated as a result of the goings on, who were escaping to Hong Kong, and you had to give them back or not?
They did escape. I never experienced that personally, but what we did find, which very unfortunately, was bodies coming down the Pearl River.
Wow.
And that they used to, people on picnics from Hong Kong used to see bodies in the river. So it was very real and in your face.
And to what extent, I mean, obviously you see that, but was it something that as an outsider that you sense that there was, because there was huge disruption and people were being persecuted and imprisoned and murdered.
Yeah, yes.
Was it the scale of it something you were aware of, or not really?
Not really, because of course Hong Kong was in the biggest scale of China, was a dot on the rump.
Yes.
And the vista from Hong Kong was very limited. It was a hotspot, but there wasn't great massive force there. The PLA were making their point; they were there,
Yes.
and we always knew that they could come across. Who knew? And of course, it was also the time of the Vietnam War going on down there.
Of course, in the 60s.
In the 60s.
And a lot of the Americans were taking their R&R in Hong Kong.
Absolutely, were they not? Yes, they were there massively. And when I was the aide-de-camp, we used to have to organize, willingly, happily organize parties for visiting U.S. warships. And the officers would like to come aboard, invite people onto the carriers or the warships. And of course, the American sailors wanted to let off steam in Hong Kong, which they did in Wan Chai. Absolutely. So that was, but they were, we all recognized that it was the war we were not involved in, but we sympathized enormously with them, and they needed their breaks, and they were happy, welcome visitors.
Okay, so let's segue now from armed forces, albeit in some really critical times in really interesting places. You start to think about leaving the comfort, if I use that word cheekily, of the army, and decide that actually you've had enough of borders and revolutions. You're going to go for the quiet life. When does that happen? Give me a fixed time-wise.
That was when I was, it was 1974. I decided to quit the army. I was going to the Army Staff College, which was an important point in an officer's career to get to the Staff College, and I was lucky enough to pass the examination and get a nomination at Staff College, which sort of proved that I wasn't a dropout. But that, for various family reasons, including family reasons, that I left. I had by then 3 small children, and money was tight. So a number of reasons I left. So I quit of my own volition, and which was a sad moment for me, but I launched myself into the blue. 1974, if you do your thinking history, it wasn't a good time to be looking for a job as a really unqualified civilian.
Yes, what's interesting, I'm just thinking now, you were changing your entire persona from a member of the armed forces, looking at Civvy Street. I was just coming out of 74, 75. I was in my final year at university, wondering, having already applied for jobs, wondering what on earth was going to happen. Because if I'm not mistaken, 74 was the miners' strike.
Absolutely. It's 3-day week and all that stuff.
3-day week. And I remember studying for my final exams at LSE under candlelight.
I did, yes. Doesn't surprise me. It was a 3-day week, and it was really.
So you coming out of, here's me as a spotty kind of not long teenager, looking and thinking, what on earth is happening to this country? And you'd come out of, after defending the country and protecting it, to disaster.
Yeah, I took it. It was like paragliding. How I had the courage to do it. It staggered me now because it wasn't good timing.
It wasn't. So what did you do when you first came out?
Well, I was offered a job. A job was lined up for me in a financial services company. It would have been a disaster for me. I would have been hopeless at that.
Right.
One of those sort of financial advisory companies. But as I left the army, I rang up my friend and said, I'm out now. And he said, oh damn, I meant to call you to say the job's off. I mean, it was that awful.
No.
Yeah, so I was literally up this morning by the paddle. But to cut a long story short, I ended up joining Imperial Tobacco in the marketing of Imperial Tobacco.
Okay.
And Imperial Tobacco then were, if anybody's familiar with this, there was really 2 big tobacco companies in operating out of the UK, British American Tobacco and Imperial Tobacco. And way back in history, they sort of carved up the world. And Imperial Tobacco stuck to UK, and Imperial BAT were international.
Were you doing any investigations in that role?
Well, not that I never knew what investigation was in those days, but okay. Yes, foreign intelligence was important because you had to know what was going on with the other brands.
I see.
And
that's where you got your first whiff of.
Probably literally to coin the phrase. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm clearly my brain is not working because I didn't really mean that pun.
No,
but there you go.
I used to have traveled all over Europe because I was in a thing called Imperial Tobacco International, which was a small group of Imperial that was tasked with recovering brands from BAT under some complicated arrangement. We had to take back some brands. The BAT had to reluctantly hand these brands across to us, and they were pretty sort of low brands.
Right.
And we had to not only take these brands back and learn to market them in places, territories that we as a company were not familiar with, but then also we were then licensed, as it were, to develop our own international brand.
And did you come across any skullduggery between brands and between salespeople?
Oh, yes.
Kickbacks and things like that.
Well, there was a lot of that. But also, yes, intelligence. You needed to know what the opposition were doing, the new brand they were planning, or you needed to have your ear to the marketplace to know what was going on. And of course, there is a tremendous trade, or was then, still is, I'm sure, in contraband cigarettes. So we had to fight the smugglers and the contraband. So we became very adept to do. I could take a cigarette packet apart very quickly and tell you whether it was real or not.
So was marketing a pseudonym for foreign intelligence investigations?
No, not really. No, marketing. No. I was a straight brand manager. I had a brand, and my job was to market it. From the whole marketing cycle of brand development to packaging to advertising and blah blah blah. But there were departments in Imperial Tobacco and I think BAT that were operated on the edges of I'm not going to say legality, but they had to deal with fight the smugglers and the counterfeiters.
Absolutely.
And they were rather especially good. I wasn't in that, actually.
No. And where did you go from Imperial? What was next stop?
Well, I had a moment of conscience over tobacco. I had been a smoker as a young man, but by then I wasn't a smoker, but I had smoked. I knew what they were all about.
Yeah.
And I learned a trick that smokers absolutely infuriated other smokers. I could have a cigarette and enjoy it and not want another, which was amazing. Still could if I wanted to, I suppose. But then I left Imperial Tobacco and joined a company called Heckler & Koch, which made guns.
Gosh. You couldn't get rid of that sort of dangerous lifestyle, could you? From the army to cigarettes that could kill you to guns that do.
Ironic, yes, it really was. And that was interesting because I joined, I got the job on the day of the Iranian embassy siege.
My God.
I was walking up St. James's Street, having decided in a meeting of Imperial Tobacco brand managers or something in a big advertising agency in St. James's Square, I suddenly felt what a dopey subject we're discussing. A lot of bright, intelligent, creative people around a big table looking at some advert for some young girl. We were pitching a brand of 23-year-old girls or something. I thought, this is not right. And I really had a sort of come to Jesus moment. And in that moment, mentally, I left.
And decided I've got to go and sell guns.
Well, no, I didn't decide that at all. I decided I had to get out of it. Yes, but no, it's not far from it. And I walked up St. James's Street, and coming down the other way was someone called Alistair Morrison, who was and had been, he was in the Scots Guards in Kenya, and he'd been with the SAS and done deeds of daring do in the SAS, and very distinguished deeds of daring do. He was one of the SAS officers who was sent by James Callaghan to storm the aircraft in Mogadishu, Kala Khalid, the German terrorist lady. So they sent two SAS officers to, an old friend. He was coming down from James's Street, and he said, I've been trying to reach you. So I said, why aren't you in St. James's Palace storming the embassy? He said, no, I left the SAS, and I've just joined Heckler & Koch, and I've had permission to get a partner to join me, and I'd like you to join me. So I joined Heckler & Koch there and then.
Real spontaneous.
It was completely spontaneous. We walked into a club in St. James's Street, had lunch, went round the corner, and their offices were in Piccadilly, and I was signed up to Heckler & Koch then and there. So for 3
But it
years.
sounds as if there wasn't too much HR protocol in those days.
No, not at all. No. For 3 years, Alice and I had an interesting time at Heckler and Koch. We laugh about, well, we don't laugh about guns, but we soldiers need guns and good ones. And the Germans produced very good weaponry, selling to the British Army, the Special Forces.
What did you learn that you hadn't learned before out of your time at the gun factory, if I can call it that?
That I hadn't learned, what I did learn.
Yes.
But I learned a lot about Germans from Swabia. I won't be about that, but the Swabish are a very tough breed of people, and they make, among other things, they're very efficient, and they produce this extraordinary machine tool process. And in Novendorf, they build superb weapons, handguns.
Yes.
With
Did you have any pangs of conscience in terms of who you were selling to and who the company did business with?
I didn't. No, I recognized that Buckingham Palace need rifles.
Yeah.
So armies, police forces, other agencies need weaponry, as we well know, and they needed good weaponry, and we needed to put weaponry in safe hands.
But you were a private company. You weren't exactly a government deciding to support. So were there not dilemmas there in terms of, do we sell arms here? Do we not sell arms there?
Yes, there were. That was probably above my pay grade at that point. But there was, at the higher level in the German, which politics kicked in. And do you sell weapons to certain African countries or not?
Was there an incident that happened, or was there a transaction that you look back on now and you say, I didn't feel comfortable with that?
I can't remember. It's a very good. I wish I could answer directly. I don't remember in Heckler Koch any particular incident, but I do remember tensions over a certain African country where we had been selling weapons, and there was a regime change. And what you sold, you sold. And then the question of, did we go on resupplying this regime? And the answer, I know, was taken no, enough.
I see. Okay.
Weapons were still there. I'm not applauding the trade, but it's not like arms dealing, which is dealing, with people. And you're careful of selling it to third parties, because you sell to some reasonable end user, but you don't know what the end user is going to do with it.
No, absolutely.
So
you and Alistair are together there for how long?
3 years.
And then who goes first?
Alistair goes. We plot to set up a company. We plot to set up a company, and Alistair and I together perceived of a company, which we would now call it a private military company, but then they weren't so well established and recognized.
Right.
PMCs, private military companies. You've all heard of them in Iraq and other places.
Because would I be right in saying you understand now what the market is like in terms of manufacturing? You also know who's buying it at the end game, and you saw an opportunity to add some value.
Yes, absolutely, that's right. And we also recognized, which other people have done, of course, over years, the value of British Army training and what that can bring to the party. So with our concept was to set up a company drawing upon mainly ex-special forces, but not entirely ex-special forces, Royal Marine Commandos, SAS, and other specialists, helicopter pilots and the rest, and offer our services to companies in difficult places as for protective security, in the same way that is now massively common around the world.
Right.
Then it wasn't so common. You had mercenaries, real mercenaries, who were paid by foreign governments who gunslinged.
Did you ever get asked to train mercenaries and people like that, Patrick, or you can't recall?
I can't recall mercenaries, and if we did, we probably shied away from it. But we trained foreign security services, yes. Okay. We worked a lot in Angola for De Beers, and De Beers had sort of vast, enormous areas of Angola where they had gold mines, and they had to protect the gold mines and the illegal gold smuggling, and they had to have their own forces, and we did train them, and that was helpful because they could be out of control, and they were armed, and we brought, I like to think, an area of sort of self-discipline and command and control.
In those days, did you have to be licensed by the government and things like that? Or?
In this country, not. No.
No.
That's the whole issue when it comes to investigation work. But no, we didn't have to be licensed.
And so, did you and Alistair ever have again that pang of conscience, or someone comes to you and says, I don't know, a diamond company, I won't use the DB, and say, look, these people are doing this, and you two sit down and think, well, I don't feel comfortable about it.
Definitely, absolutely, it happened. I mean, Africa is usually the place it happened.
Yeah,
and we took some decisions that were commercially attractive, but morally we felt and commercially dangerous. And
is there anything that happened where you all in good conscience, you said, and you made a decision saying, on balance, I think this is the right thing to do, and then turned out that you'd made not a horrific, but you'd made a decision that you didn't feel comfortable about?
Good question. I don't recall. Not that we were perfect, but I don't recall. But we did have 4 of our people kidnapped in Angola.
Wow.
So we obviously made not a mistake, but we put people in harm's way there, and they were kidnapped. And I was not directly involved because I was running our Middle East business by then, but Alistair had to go through a lot of negotiation to get them back, which he did.
And was it a ransom kind of request or something?
Yes, it was ransom.
Right.
And also, we were working for De Beers at the time, I think, so they obviously were our masters, and so between us we got them back safely. But I think it was more, don't mess with us sort of thing, a shot across our bows.
I see. Okay.
But they got out okay, but that was edgy, undoubtedly.
Right. And how long were you in the PMC for?
For about 3 years, and then that took me. We working in Africa, as I said, but we also worked in the Middle East, and I went over and ran our Middle East business. So we set up we had a little headquarters in Cyprus, but then we had a joint venture in Jordan, in Amman, in Jordan.
Okay.
And there we teamed up with the former deputy chief of the general staff, who'd been retired from the general staff, and he'd become the commissioner of police. And then he left the police, Jordan, obviously, and a very senior man. He was a general in the police, in the army. And he set up his own security company, and we teamed up with him as a joint venture. Again, bringing together.
I've got to ask, because every other location you've been in, there's been a crisis. What was going on in the Middle East while you were there?
This is in the Iran-Iraq war was going on.
I see. Okay.
And that was edgy because it wasn't my business, but it wasn't the business I was in. But weapons were reaching the various sides in that conflict, and a lot of it was going through places like Amman.
Right, I see.
But our job was protective security. We tried to stick to that, and we got a job protecting the U.S. Embassy in Amman, providing.
Had this morphed into DSL?
It was DSL. This was DSL. Okay. Yeah, so I covered the whole region. I was based in Jordan, but also I was working in Dubai and Bahrain.
Yes.
I had a little outpost. And in Bahrain, I secured a contract with the U.S. Embassy there to provide a third guard force. In other words, they had their U.S. Marines inside, who themselves were targets, and the local forces outside. But they wanted a third force, a buffer force.
I see.
Green. And I came up with the suggestion of Gurkhas, ex or former Gurkhas. And they didn't know much about Gurkhas, the U.S. Security apparatus, but I convinced them of the value. So I found myself going off to northern India and Nepal and recruiting former Gurkhas, British Army and Indian Army Gurkhas.
Right.
And the Gurkhas are very special soldiers, as you know.
Yeah.
You must have seen them in places in Hong Kong and other places. And I, not being a former Gurkha officer, because they had British officers in the Gurkhas, as you know. But this is, again, it's a very special relationship between Gurkha soldiers and their British officers,
Correct.
Which is very close bond. And I wasn't one of those. But the fact that I had been a British Army officer and I could wear a
enabled you to bring the gang together.
Yeah, so I arrived with a sort of an aura of friendship and authority. And I recruited 100 Gurkhas and marched them, as it were, to Bahrain and set them
Any
up.
particular incident that you can think of that an penetration of the security setup that was worthy of note while you were protecting people?
No, you see, you're longing for me to find some sort of bombshell out of this thing. No, because we did a good job. The Gurkhas were very good. The only thing they weren't allowed was to carry their kukris, the big knives they had. That was a step too far.
That was a no-no. Okay.
No, yeah, that would scare anybody.
So let's move closer to the transition from DSL into both Kroll and the UK, because I know that's where you went next. So tell me a little bit about that transition and how it happened.
Well, that's a strange story in a way. I was working in Jordan, as I said, and with these Jordanian partners, and there was a young man there, a Jordanian, who remains a very close friend. And he said to me one day, we've had a request from an American to learn a bit about a hijack that had happened. I think a Kuwaiti Airways jet, well, I can't remember the airline, Middle East Airlines jet, had been taken off in, I think, Kuwait, and landed Dubai, and taken off again when it was hijacked and taken to Iran, Tehran airport, where the combination was that the US pilot was shot dead.
Wow.
Horrible experience. And that's, I think the background to this was a lawsuit in the States against the airline by the families, I think. So they needed to understand where the weaponry had come on. You can imagine how, for legal, but you're the lawyer, the legal analysis of how this came about for insurance and et cetera. So the Jordanians said the Americans think we know everything. We certainly don't, and you know Dubai better than we do. So go to Dubai and try and get to the bottom of it. And I was able to do that through my contacts in Dubai. I won't go into it, but I got the answer they were looking, an answer, which was very valuable. So I wrote up that report and gave it to my Jordanian friends with my compliments as a report. This report found its way by circuitous means to the desk of one Jules Kroll in New York. Whereupon Jules said, "Who wrote that?" And the American said, "I have no idea, some Brit in the States."
Jules was representing one of the parties.
He was representing, I suppose, the lawsuit, yes. Yeah, whatever. So he found this report, but landed on his desk, and it was a very compelling report, apparently. And so, as it were, they pulled the threads in, and I was on the end.
Right. Are you on the other end? Are you able to tell us anything about how you tracked down the supplier without, of course, compromising?
No, I can't. I had, in Dubai, because my job was security, I had very close contacts with the senior intelligence officers, the UAE intelligence officers, and they were very helpful. I can't go beyond that.
Okay.
We got the answer.
So
Jules apparently said, "I want us to meet this guy."
Right.
So I was tracked down, and I still have somewhere in a filofax a message I received long before we had telex in those days. Call Mr. Crow, C-R-O-W, in New York. So I got this message, I don't know how. So I called Mr. Crow in New York, and this telephone answer that said, I said, "Can I speak to Mr. Crow?" They said, "Do you Mr. Crow?" I said, "Well, maybe." And then I found myself being bidden to New York by Jules Kroll.
I hope he flew you first class, Patrick.
Ticket, come and meet me. So I was intrigued.
Did he fly you first class?
I don't remember first class, but knowing Jules' style, he probably did, but I don't remember. But I was intrigued, of course. So I took time out, went to New York, went into this funny little office on Third Avenue, which was above the place where they tried to murder Gotti, literally a little Italian cafe. And the floor above was the Kroll's office.
Great location.
Which was a small office, 20 people in a small office, where I met Jules and other Kroll characters who still around today, I guess.
What did you know about the private investigation industry at that stage? Anything?
Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing.
So when you went to see
really
Mr. Crow, it was just the kind of again, spontaneous decision saying, I may as well, I've got nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Let's go and talk to him.
Absolutely. But I said to Jules at the time, I said, look, I've got a job with DSL. It's all going fine. And he sort of said, don't worry about that. We'll fix it. So it was complicated, and we happily negotiated with Alistair, my partners. Jules wanted me to join them. So I said to my partner, so that's what I want to do. So I joined Kroll, left DSL, joined Kroll.
Right.
I couldn't come back to England for tax purposes, so I was in Paris for 6 months, working for Kroll, on and off. I mean, I was retained by them, and I didn't do very much. Or I wasn't asked to do very much. And then I found my way back to London, where they just sent across someone called Dan Carson, a lawyer working with ex-prosecutor working for Kroll in New York, to put a stake into UK.
Right.
And he was one man and a secretary in Leadenhall Street, just behind the Bank of England. I pushed the door open, and there was this chap looking rather like Woody Allen, actually, mind me saying that, opening a box. And he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Patrick Grayson. I work for Kroll." And he said, "Well, so do I. Open that box." You know, that was the beginning of my time in Kroll in London. And then Dan Carson, wasn't comfortable in London, but he did a good job. So to get the thing right. Then he said, as soon as he could, he handed the parcel to me and said, "I'm off, leaving me."
And was there like a rule book, a guidebook that said
Nope.
Investigations 101, this is what
Nope.
you do, you pick up the phone?
Nope.
No.
On the job. It was an extraordinary time for me, an extraordinary break for me, because I was given a carte blanche by Jules with vague control from New York. I'd obviously picked up a few tricks along the way, but we were left very much to our own devices. Jules used to come across a lot and take me to meetings with him, and I learned the spiel from Jules.
Who were you targeting? Was it anybody that would talk to you, or was there a particular focus?
Yes, because Jules, you see, by that point, he'd become Wall Street's private eye, quote unquote.
I see.
There was then an article in the New York Times, I think, suddenly a headline, Jules with his feet on the desk and a big cigar and his big suspenders.
Right.
Wall Street private eye. And Jules had perceived of the investigators, not men in shadows or women in shadows, men in dressed up. I happen to be a suit and tie now. So we were suddenly dressed up and acceptable in the boardrooms of Wall Street, and Jules was. And it was already then becoming the word of mouth that if you had a hostile bid in an acquisition or something, or some big problem investigation, the person you called was Jules Kroll.
Okay.
And that's where he started. But then he entrusted to me, or others, but essentially entrusted to me, the carving out the space in London. So that was carving out new territory. And this comes back to the whole, we talked of, the whole industry, if that's the right word, sector, that now is occupied by a massive number of players. There were other players here. There was people, Mike Comer, of Network. He was already on the ground doing the sort of work. John Ferris Smith of Argent. But they were doing it rather low profile.
Right.
Jules was up there.
Yeah,
and
he was definitely out there and up there. So what was the first big investigation that you got involved with in Kroll?
Well, when I joined, we were looking at Baby Doc Duvalier.
Baby Doc, wow.
Baby Doc.
And tell me a bit about that scenario.
Well, I fell into that. Dan Carson, who was very clever when he was in London still, before he hightailed it back to UK, he was, I think, running the case from London. So I learned a lot from him. And essentially we were doing asset tracing on his ill-gotten gains from the people of Haiti, and he'd stashed it all around the world.
So you were acting for the government of Haiti at the time?
Yes.
Kind of.
It was very complicated, but yeah, we were tasked to try and find where he stashed the assets.
Right. So I'm going to ask you, Patrick, that you're not going to get away with just that. Tell me a bit about what you were able to do, because this is not, high tech. How did you go about this exercise? What was involved?
Well, this was, remember, talking about 1986, before the days of the internet, and then it was and actually remains today still a lot of shoe leather.
Yeah.
Force intelligence was the key to it. So we had to work very hard. We had a thing called Nexus and Lexus was the only sort of database we had those days. So it was all hard finding sources, finding subcontractors, knowing where the bodies, as it were, might lie, the assets might lie, and developing human resources to go and get the answers. So it was men in Maputo, men in women, sources in Monte Carlo, sources in Geneva, sources in Switzerland. You had to find these sources and proper intelligence work of winkle out of them to the extent of their knowledge. And people often know a lot more than they think they know. So you've got to sort of see behind.
Was there a particular, not a name, because I know you well enough by now, you're not going to say, yes, it was Mr. Smith who lived at 19, whatever it is, but an individual that either for their own reasons or for other reasons opened the door, either a little or a lot, and gave you access to a real cachet of assets.
Yes, there was. And that was in Monaco, I can't remember how we could find him. But
doesn't matter how you found him.
Yeah, we had a name for a code name for him. I can't remember what it was. But he was the bird we needed to sing. And he was very, very helpful with them. I can talk, if you talk more about asset tracing, Saddam Hussein was another one, which I was much more closely
involved. Was this fellow for Papa Doc, was he your classic intermediary?
Absolutely was. He was
incorporating companies, opening bank accounts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that kind of man in Monaco.
In Monaco, okay.
But he was opened a Pandora's box for us, and that was a big breakthrough in Papa Doc.
Were you the one that got the information from him, or was it one of your team?
No, it was a subcontractor. We did it through subcontractors.
Okay.
Got that. But it was
so just tell me, in those scenarios, everybody, particularly when you see so many movies, everybody is concerned about the information being tracked back to them and them being.
Yeah, of course, yes. Yeah.
How does that work? How do you protect that person?
First of all, you have to be very conscious of what's their motivation for telling you. Well, first of all, backing up, I have always had a philosophy that secrets are not secrets in certain places. Every secret is a secret, but in some places it's not a secret.
Yeah.
A man's secret from his affairs may be secret to his family, but not to the men in the golf club, sort of thing.
Got it.
A crude example. So you need to identify where the secret is not a secret.
I see.
In the office of the fiduciaire, it's not a secret, and the secretaries know, people know who are dealing with. So you need to identify the little sort of buzz box of where the secret is, and that's a task in itself. And then you need to find somebody who knows that, and you've got to find that person who would have the means and the motivation to share that, perhaps unknowingly. So it's against the game.
Perhaps just because of boasting about, I act for so-and-so and I opened an account. I see.
Yes. And you have to be, we, in all the trade I've been in this business, we try and do it right. It's not big brown envelopes. It's often you can find a motivation that isn't, you don't feel uncomfortable about.
Right.
If you're paying someone to breach their fiduciary duties and so on, you're in dangerous areas there for them and ethically for you.
And in the being, of course, a man that lives and has lived in the various court systems, with the Papa Doc case, was this totally out with the legal court system, or was it a combination of legal action?
Combination. We know, because you and I work together. The best, we always said in my business, if we can work alongside a law firm, it gives us much greater power and capability.
Of course.
And the strategy can be so much better. I mean, investigators who go wild can get into real trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, not just to get it wrong. We have to be guided by. I like to be guided by law firms.
But something as big as Papa Doc clearly would have had international political implications. And were there times in that case where you were able to as it were, call in aid some of the government who were affected by Papa Doc, who wanted to help you?
Yeah, but if I could switch the conversation from Papa Doc, which I wasn't central to,
okay,
into a similar case of Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi regime,
where you were central to.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, I was
right. Okay,
yeah, that came later. So I was a bit of a new boy on the block in the Duvalier days, so that's why I'm a little hazy. But very much under my watch, we got the assignment. And here I talk about how we as a company, Kroll, worked, probably still do, in the United States, often for U.S. agencies. U.S. agencies are far more inclined to reach out to the private sector in the United States than in this country, and probably elsewhere in Europe.
Help me here. What chronological timing are we talking about? How long after Saddam Hussein was toppled, or
no? This was at the height of the Iraq of the war.
The height of the war, when the American forces and the Allied forces are bombarding.
Absolutely, the height of the war, and we were retained by the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is the task on behalf of the Kuwaiti government to go after the financial supply stream to the Iraqis. They were being funded,
right?
And how were they funding them? Because there were a lot of forces that were trying of financial process to try and discover where the source was, how are they getting the money in and out. And we were tasked to do it. It was a global assignment for Kroll, but we were playing central in UK with Europe on our doorstep, and we soon identified Saddam Hussein's brother Tarzan al-Takriti, who was killed later on, and he was Saddam's brother-in-law, I think, yes, and he was the United Nations ambassador based in Geneva. That was his quote role, unquote. But he was actually operating in Geneva for
siphoning out the funds.
Exactly, yeah. So we had to discover who he was tasking, who he was dealing with, and we had him under surveillance.
Right.
Again, surveillance is a whole subject that people get twitchy about. I'm quite clear in my mind about surveillance, its values and its risks and its dangers.
Right.
But there was obviously bona fide reason to see who he was meeting and who he was dealing with. So, bearing in mind, it's a foreign country, we had to conduct ourselves properly, but we had him under surveillance, so we were able to track down who he was meeting in the lobbies of the hotels of Geneva.
Right.
And that was quite a extensive exercise, and not cheap exercise, as you will know. And also source intelligence about the scuttlebutt in the communities in Geneva, the gossips in the restaurants and the hotels. We really got under the skin of the Geneva community to find out how this man was living and working in Geneva under auspices that were plainly concocted, and what he was doing. And we managed to discover, I won't name it, but the fiduciary company that was the junction point.
Right.
Did that by.
And were there many of those junction points, or was this?
This was an absolutely major junction point. It was like a major terminal, and there were local Swiss managers.
And otherwise, on the face of it, legitimate and well-respected organization.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And that we absolutely nailed it, that they were the organization that was funding it. And then what we discovered in passing was that, amongst other things, they had been instrumental in taking a very large slice of Hachette, investing in a large slice of the French publishing company group Hachette. And that became public, whether by intent or mistake, probably by intent. It was announced that it had been discovered that Saddam Hussein had something like 80% of Hachette, a large, sizable stake in Hachette. But of course, in the middle of it, it really hit the headlines.
And did the name of the middleman ever get revealed in the litigation or in the criminal prosecution?
Yeah. His name. Well, the aftermath you're going to ask me about, I don't fully know the aftermath, because like a lot of these things, in our business, one of the frustrations is when you've done the hard work, it sort of goes into the legal sort of world, and you never quite hear the outcome, and it takes a long time. So the question was whether the Kuwaitis ever recovered. What they should have done is a good question, and the answer probably is they didn't act as they should have done. Forcefully.
Well, you've got what he took from Kuwait, but then you've got what he was squirreling away from Iraq for many, many, many years.
Yes, and we discovered a lot. Plainly, this fiduciary company, we discovered a lot about.
Did the fiduciary company? I just asked you, and you said yes, it was named. Are you unable to mention the name of that company?
I don't feel comfortable to do so.
You don't?
I don't.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No.
And do they still exist to this day?
I don't know.
I see. Okay.
No, I think they did become public. I think.
And did anyone get prosecuted for that, or you just don't know?
I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is that Hachette were deeply embarrassed by this, and it caused a major furore. And I had an interesting aside about this because I was in New York about this time, and I went to a social event in New York with a friend of mine. And as I arrived at the door, she took me to one side. I said, oh, by the way, just so you know, because it was all in the news, over in the corner there is the North American head of Hachette. So I said, okay, fine. So what? He was then introduced to me, and I said, I'm Kroll, thinking he would be elegant and sort of whatever. He grabbed his wife's hand, and as only French can, he flounced out. Left the party. I just want to say it was not my fault, but it was rather funny at the time.
And do you recall at all the amount of the value of that which you were able to either track and or recover?
Gary, I'm going to fail you. I don't know that.
No. Okay, that's fine.
Sorry. But that was a pretty impressive scalp for the Grayson belt, if I may use that expression. Yes, it was.
And the next one that you can think of?
It was me and one of my people in London who you know.
Yeah.
Who did that. So that was a what I call a major set piece investigation. The whole firm was involved in that one way or another. It was a major.
Was there any other investigation that was difficult to find something as high profile? But what was the next high profile investigation that you were involved with?
Well, over time we did a lot of work on Polly Peck.
With Nazil Adair.
Nazil Adair, yes. Both before and after he did a runner from his office in just by the corner of Berkeley Square.
Yeah, hidden in I can't remember, in a fruit bat box or something. Is that right?
Yes, he did a run. Yes. And then we followed him to Northern Cyprus, where anyway, that was a set piece exercise.
Can you tell us anything about what happened in that you can anonymize, other than in somebody said this and we were able to then track him to a particular location?
No, actually, see, I'm feeling you here, Gary. I can't.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, but it was we sort of knew it was happening before the whatnot hit the fan. We were very aware of what was going down. So for some reason, I can't remember quite why, we had him under surveillance at the time.
Right.
And we missed the time that he did a runner from, I can't remember what airport he got away from. But I'm not good at it. My memory is not good.
And I know we're getting close to the witching hour, but and we'll have to concertina things.
Yes.
But you leave Kroll, you've done your time, and you've had at least a couple of huge investigations, and then you decide that you want to have your own shop.
Yes.
And you do that with the blessing of the man of JK.
Yeah, perfectly agreeable. Yeah.
And you start a company called GPW.
No, that came later, actually.
Oh, okay.
When I left Kroll, I set up a small company called CX.
Ah, that's right.
CIX.
I was aware of that.
With a colleague of mine from Kroll.
Right.
And we were there together for 2 years, and then
Yep.
for various reasons we split. And I spent a period of time then operating entirely independently as an independent consultant, because then I knew pretty much all the heads of all the companies in London.
Right.
By then, there'd been a starburst of other companies, sort of lookalikes from Kroll. And it was healthy because competitors were, nothing is more complementary than a competitor or imitator. And they were all over the place, and you know
Right.
a lot of them, and I think you probably interviewed some of them for this program. And so I operated very healthily my business. I was the person that if people knew of me, they came to me first, they being clients, institutions, investment banks, law firms even, said, here's this issue. Where can we get the best value
Right.
for our buck in this sector?
You were the respected broker.
Yes, I was. So I knew how to interpret a client's need into language that an investigation firm would understand and get the best value. So
Yeah.
I was on occasion tasked to go out and get an investment bank in New York said to me, gave me a task, said, we want to get 4 quotes for this work. So I went to names I can name, went to Kroll, Alico, Control Risks, and Hachette. Got individual, like getting quotes for a building site, and then was able to assess those and make recommendations. And the clients acted upon my recommendations, and I took my fee from the client, not sort of backhanded. And so I did that.
But then you got itchy feet and or itchy backside, and you said I needed to get out there again.
Not itchy feet, I got cold feet.
Oh, I see.
Operating by yourself, as anybody who's done it will know, it's good news and bad news. It's quite lonely sometimes. So I decided to set up my own company again. So I moved to an office in the West End, and found myself literally bumping into 2 colleagues from Kroll. They're still at Kroll, but I discovered they were leaving Kroll, and they were younger than me, and you know, I had some age and some experience and a book of business, and they had young men leaving Kroll, decided to find a landing pad, and I was a landing pad, and they were GPW, Peter Pentecost.
And if you had to pick one particular investigation that you did with your GPW hat on that you can tell us a little bit about, which one would that be?
Let me think. We did so many things there. We got very involved. Well, can I mention a couple of, you've talked once before about moral judgment. And there were some cases that we did at GPW when we really had to take a view on the morality of what we were doing.
But you need to flesh it out, because I understand everyone's got moral dilemmas.
Yeah. Well, one actually, this at Kroll, we took a decision here. We were working for a law class action suit representing the victims of asbestosis.
Yeah.
And that was people were dying of asbestosis through monstrous misbehavior on behalf of the companies involved. And our job was to try and track down the asbestosis sufferers and get them together. And of course, it became very apparent to us that the client, actually not the client, was dragging their heels, whereas the asbestosis claimants were dropping dead rather quickly. So there was suddenly impetus to get these people, move the case along while they were still alive and well enough to benefit from the event. And it was a real issue to us that the other side.
But this was really still at Kroll. I wanted you to cover something at GPW.
Oh yeah, well there was one case was we were working for a major lawsuit for a UK bank, and the other party was a Russian oligarch, a name familiar to many of us, and we had to serve him papers, which was absolutely critical in the whole case. And he, like many of those people, was surrounded by serried ranks of bodyguards and very well conducting protection. And it took us 6 months to serve him, to find the moment when we could throw the documents into his hand. But we knew any day of the week we would have caught him in London taking his kids to school. We knew where he lived, and we knew where he took his children. And this man, to his credit, was in the habit of taking little kids to school in a London street.
Yes.
It would have been easy as pie to go and serve him over his little kids' heads.
Right.
We felt very, very uncomfortable about that. And we took our own decision, no, we're not going to do that. And we're going to tell the client if we don't feel comfortable. And to their credit, the client said, you're right, we don't want it done on our watch. So I felt good about that. And the fact
how did you serve him?
By hurling, well, not personally, we penetrated the security team, distracted them, and he was getting into his car in a certain well-known place, and the man just got through the security cordon, opened the door, and handed the paper, and he took it.
Okay, you've got to tell me what the distraction was. That can't be a secret.
Well, they caused I think a bicycle fell over, a motorbike fell over.
So a staged pretend accident.
Exactly, it was really well done, and the car stopped.
And everyone goes to help the poor victim, and then you nip in and you serve the rascal.
Yes. Well, there's an interesting, you see, that the security staff of the man went to help the victim. What they should have done was ignore him. But that's
there you are, natural instinct.
Natural, yeah, exactly. We played on their good instincts, poor things, and they fell for it. So there's a bit of a game.
Were those English proceedings you were serving, or for
the English proceedings? Right in this town around me here.
Okay. Now, we're getting really close to the witching hour.
Sorry.
I want to ask you, have you ever been cross-examined in court as a result of investigation activities that you or the company you were involved in? Has that been something you've had the displeasure of facing?
No, never myself. I think we have provided expert witnesses on occasion.
Right.
In my Kroll days, we also investigated the death of the Italian banker. Help me.
Oh, God's banker?
God's banker under Blackfriars Bridge.
Blackfriars Bridge.
And we were investigating his supposed suicide. And our person, I can name him, Jeff Katz, he's now sadly died.
Yes.
He had to give expert witness in that because he'd done a very deep, well, we managed a very deep investigation, but he was my case manager on that. We even had a model in the office of the Blackfriars Bridge and its scaffolding, and Jeff had to give witness statement in court.
But not you. You've never been cross-examined?
No. I haven't, no, luckily. I wouldn't want you on the other side either.
Well, sadly, because I'm, just a poor relation of the barristerial solicitorial combination, I'm always there sitting comfortably, as it were, while the barrister does the real heavy lifting.
Yes.
Before we part company, at least on this program, let me just throw something that often is asked of people who have been in the business as long as you have. As Frank Sinatra would say, regrets, I have a few.
Yeah. Not many. I've enjoyed very much my career in this. I think that I could have, if I'd stuck with the smaller companies and grown them more rapidly, more cannily, I could have been probably more successful.
Right. You mean financially?
Yes. Well, in every way. I mean, GPW became too big.
Right.
Very quickly, which is a pity.
Yeah.
We started a small company, just 3 partners and a very small team. And we were doing very well, but we overstretched ourselves and got too many people and then had to downsize, which was really sad. And that was a mistake, and I learned that mistake. So I would have been small and lean. And I think, the company CX that I set up would have a good foundation.
So small, lean and mean, and not get tempted by being too big.
That's right.
Right. Is that the advice that you would give to people starting?
I would, yes, absolutely. I know young people who've worked with many people, and I'm proud to say that many of the people I've worked with have now gone on to great success, and it's a matter of pride to me. And the ones who till today have got probably half a dozen I know well, who are operating very well by themselves and being most
Can
successful.
you throw up a name or two? I probably know them. Who would it be that you say they've kept it lean, kept it mean, and they've got a real solid and successful business?
Well, there's a girl called Jessica from Crow.
Jessica Miller?
Jessica Miller, yeah, your namesake. Jessica
Yes.
Miller, who is was one of our star players at
Kroll.
Crow. No, at GPW.
I see. Okay.
And she set up herself, and she's done very well indeed. And she's got lots of languages, this young lady, which helps. And she's done terribly well by herself.
And of course, Alico did very well, but they were not necessarily your disciples, or they were?
Oh, very much so, yes.
Right.
Very much so.
Okay. So that was the obvious answer, because they've just been bought out by private equity.
Yes, they have. Yeah, well, they've. I mean, I can say it because they were. You may be interviewing some of them. Amy Lashinsky, who just retired from. She was one of my first American implants or exports, whatever you want to call it, from the United States. And she arrived in London when she was 26 years old and became one of my star players in London. I also employed at about the same time Ambrose Carey.
I hope, Patrick, that when she signed and Ambrose on the dotted line for all of that money, which I know nothing about, but other than it must have been a king's ransom, that she raised a glass to Patrick Grayson. I just hope she did that.
She did, actually.
Excellent. On that note,
I'm very, very proud of them.
There is no nicer, happier note to end a wonderful sojourn through the very small smatterings of the life of Patrick. I'm sure there's much more to be covered, but what a lovely point to end the success of others that came through and were guided by you. There's no better feeling. So Patrick, thank you so much for sharing some of your journey with me. And I'm really grateful, and I wish nothing but continued success for Patrick and whatever you're doing.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please click and subscribe to the Intelligence Advantage podcast on Spotify and other platforms.